I've built a lot of things in my life, but I had never built a boat until 2019 when I ripped the first cedar strips which I hoped would someday become a kayak. This is the story of that boat. Boat building is defined as the art and craft of creating vessels for water travel and recreation. It has a long and proud history, which probably started with some guy who lashed two logs together and yelled, "Hold my beer." The knowledge and techniques of shipwrights is borderline magic, especially to someone like me who has always been fascinated by the tall sailing ships of the past, even though I am from the Midwest, about as far from an ocean as you can get. But I do love water, so whether it's an ocean, a Great Lake, or even a day of fishing, you'll probably find me with my feet in it. I have been blessed with great friends, an outstanding group of fun-loving, kind, beautiful, and often crazy women. We love vintage campers and fly fishing. Locally, we call ourselves the Jackknife Gypsies, but we're also members of a nationwide organization called the Sisters on the Fly, which is the largest outdoor women's group in the United States. It was started in 1999 by two real sisters, Maury Sussman and Becky Clark, who were fly fishing on a beautiful river somewhere in Montana, when they decided they were having so much fun that they should invite their friends, which they did. And it grew to over 22,500 women so far. We host a variety of events across the country, and I encourage you to check it out. Even if you don't have a vintage camper or fly fish, it's a great organization to join. One day I realized that most of the women that I like to camp with had kayaks, so I decided to buy one. I spent a year looking for the perfect kayak, but for some unknown reason I couldn't find it. 12 months later, I was getting frustrated, and I knew that if I didn't do something soon, I would be spending another summer watching from the shoreline. As I tried to define what kind of kayak it was that I wanted, it finally occurred to me why none of the ones I'd seen would work. It was because I had been spoiled as a child. I grew up on the water at Lake Byron, a small, shallow lake near here in South Dakota that we would escape to on weekends. Over the years, we had had a variety of boats, and each one had been a handmade wooden boat built by my dad. My favorite was the cedar strip canoe that Dad built with 4 of his grandkids, our 2 sons and 2 of their cousins. It was an amazing project for 4 little boys whose ages ranged from 5 to 10 years old. They learned a lot and were so proud when they finally launched it. So I decided to build my own kayak. I didn't really know what I was doing or even where to start, but I figured I would either end up with a beautiful boat or a sweet-smelling bonfire. I bought a book called Kayak Craft by Ted Moores of the Bear Mountain Boat Shop in Peterborough, Ontario. The book is filled with photos, full of step-by-step instructions, and lots of information that helped along the way. The first thing I needed was a shop to work in. My workshop is 16 foot square, but it would be too small for any construction. My dad was in an assisted living facility at that time, and he was no longer able to work in the large shop that he had used for restoring vintage airplanes. He was thrilled when I asked if I could use it because that meant I would be checking on things there on a regular basis. The plans were written out in an efficient code made up of numbers and measurements with plus and minus signs. By drawing a grid on paper, you will use those numbers to plot points, making it possible to draw the pattern pieces for the molds, which will create a 3-dimensional form called a strongback. This is what the thin wooden strips will be bent over to form the kayak. The molds and the strongback are just a support to build on, and will be removed before you finish the boat. For the base of my strongback, I used a 16-foot pine 2x8 that I screwed on to a pair of wooden sawhorses. Then, lining up the horizontal reference line on each pattern piece, The molds are temporarily mounted onto boards that are called mold extensions, and then screwed to the base. I chose to build one of the patterns included in the book. The 14-foot venture design has 13 stations or molds, plus pieces for the bow and stern. Since I would be building the hull or the bottom of the kayak first, the molds were mounted upside down. I logged 60 hours of work gathering tools, drawing and cutting out pattern pieces, building the strongback, and covering the surfaces that would come in contact with the cedar strips with masking tape so that I wouldn't accidentally glue the molds onto the boat. But I was finally ready to start building the kayak. I had just added the first pieces of the actual boat when Dad got very sick. He passed away early in the morning on New Year's Eve 2019. It happened quickly, but we were able to gather the family together and to say our goodbyes. Everything stopped, including the work on the kayak, as we planned his funeral, took care of the details that arose with his passing, and dealt with the loss of losing our father. It took a while before I could return to his shop, and even longer before I could pick up a tool and continue working on the boat. Before Dad passed away, I had been trying to figure out if I wanted to add a decorative strip on the sides of the kayak. But 2 months after Dad's funeral, in the middle of the night, I suddenly woke up and knew exactly what I wanted to do. At that point, I didn't know how I was going to make it work, or even what it would say, but I knew I wanted to create a message in Morse code on the sides of the boat. Dad had earned his ham radio operator's license as a teenager. He loved talking to people around the world and was a member of the local and state radio clubs. This meant that my brother, sister, and I had grown up listening to the mystical rhythm of Morse code. As it turned out, deciding on the message wasn't hard at all. In fact, it showed up on my computer screen the next morning when I searched for a key or Morse code translator to help me convert the alphabet. The very first result that popped up in response to my search was a Bible verse that someone had converted to code. It was Genesis 1, verse 26. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, in our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air, over the livestock, over all the earth, and over all the creatures that move along the ground." Obviously, it was too long, but the meaning was perfect. I ripped strips of pine for the background and strips of walnut to frame the top and bottom of the decorative panel, hoping these woods would create a nice contrast. Creating the dots would be simple. I could use the drill press to drill holes which would be filled with round oak plugs that you can purchase at any hardware store. The dashes, on the other hand, took a little time and experimenting to figure out, but after several failed attempts and another trip to the hardware store, I ended up standing in an aisle looking at a package of fluted wooden dowels. These are used for strengthening the joints in furniture and cabinet construction, but all I saw was a package of dashes. I had never used a router before, and Dad's big one scared me, so I purchased a small handheld one and built a jig that I could clamp to the workbench to securely hold the narrow pine strips and to accommodate the faceplate that came with the router. I added 2 screws to mark the spacing I needed, and the router was adjusted to a shallow setting so it wouldn't cut through the thin strips but would create a trough where I could glue an oak dowel on its side into the strip. Once the glue was dry, I used a hand plane to shave off the top half of the dowel, and this left a tidy little dash in the pine strip. Starting at the bow on the port side of the kayak and wrapping around the stern and continuing back up the bow to the starboard side, it says, "Let mankind have dominion over the fish of the sea, birds of the air, and all creatures upon the earth." The rest of the hull was pretty straightforward. Cut, fit, glue, and repeat until the form was completely covered. Then it was time to plane it, fix any issues, and then the sanding began. On January 29, 2021, I was finally able to take my first crack at fiberglassing. That was an experience, but the strength you gain by adding the fabric and resin is incredible, and the grain and colors of the wood blew me away. I worked from 8 a.m. till after 7 p.m. that day and was so pleased with how it looked. After the resin had cured for a couple weeks and a little wet sanding to touch up a couple of runs, the hull was done. We then lifted and flipped the kayak, hoping that the plywood molds would stay in place. The strong back is then retrofitted with padded cradles that fit the shape of the hull. These hold the kayak upright so you can build the deck. By this time you halfway know what you're doing, and the deck, which is smaller, goes together pretty fast. The coded message was to honor my father, so I added a mariner's compass to the deck in memory of my mom, who had passed away in 2013. She had loved creating quilts using that design. It didn't take long to finish the deck, and then it was time to remove the screws that held it together and lift the deck off to remove the plywood molds. Then carefully I fitted the deck back in place. Once the deck was glued and screwed onto the hull and the fiberglass was cured, I decided to say goodbye to Dad's shop and bring the kayak home. It fit well inside the horse trailer, along with Dad's old drill press. Then, with a final goodbye to the marmot that had moved into Dad's garage, it was time to head to the ranch. My father-in-law's old garage became my new boathouse, and I started work on the last step of it, the cockpit and the coaming. I carefully measured from the bow and then from the stern, but no matter how many times I measured, the spacing for the cockpit never worked out right. And when I measured the boat from end to end, I knew why. The boat was too long. This is when I discovered that way back at the very beginning of the project, I had made a slight error. I hadn't built the strong back exactly like the one in the book. Mine was a simplified version, and in following the instructions for mounting the stations, I had misread the part that said to place the molds 12 inches apart on center. Yes, that's right. I had placed them 12 inches apart. This added up to an additional 13 inches in length. My 14-foot kayak was actually 15 foot and 1 inch long. Throughout my life, the number 13 has shown up at random times, usually as a lucky number for me. I've always believed that all things happen for a reason, even mistakes. So while sitting there looking at the boat and cussing myself for making a crazy mistake, one thing became obvious. The kayak had to be 15 foot and 1 inch long, because if it had been any shorter than that, the Bible verse would not have fit. There are a lot of steps to building a kayak, and they have to be done in the correct order for everything to work. Think of it as a large jigsaw puzzle that you cut the pieces for as you put it together. All the way through this build, I constantly worried about the next step. I would read about it, think about it, and finally I would have convinced myself there was no way it would work out. But every step of the process and every strip of wood fell into place like it was supposed to. Along the way, I found out that I love using hand planes, and the way the wood shavings curl in my hand makes me smile. I learned that life is chaos if you don't have enough clamps, but in a pinch, rubber bands and plate hangers work surprisingly well. I'm pretty sure that cedar is the most beautiful wood on earth, even though it's full of wicked splinters. And in boat building, one day you will realize you have sanded it for the last time. Unless, of course, you put a ding in the finish. Then it starts all over again. The best advice I can give you if you decide to build your own kayak is to be careful as you work. Wear eye protection always, a good dust mask when you're sanding, and rubber gloves when you're pouring resin. Take it one step at a time and don't worry about the rest. It might not be perfect when you're finished, but I bet you will be the only one who knows where the mistakes are. On August 8th, 2021, with a splash of champagne on her deck and the waters of the Black Hills under her hull, the kayak was christened Bess. She was named after a great aunt who was also a big woman, but one whom I loved very much. She took her maiden voyage 4 miles from the shop where she was built. and I hope to return to this same lake for the last lake of a challenge. Who knows? Maybe I'll see you there. If you enjoyed the story of my boat Bess, please hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. It's what keeps me going. And if you ever make it to the Black Hills of South Dakota, be sure to bring your kayak, and I hope to meet you on the water.
Called what? Split shot outdoor. Okay, I'll quickly say.